So Lent begins. So many of the things we do at the beginning of Lent are a reminder of our humanity, our limitations, but also of the blessings and the identity which is ours too. And it all starts with Ash Wednesday. We take ashes that have been mixed with oil and we mark our heads with the sign of the cross. And we hear the words, "Remember you are dust, and to dust you will return." It is a moment of humility. We realise afresh that our lives don't go on forever, that we are fashioned from dust and back to dust one day we will return. But that is also a reminder of our original blessing. The moment when God scooped up the dust and formed it into the human, breathing life into it with his own life, bringing it alive. And to be of dust is no small thing. It is not something to be ashamed of. To be from the dust is to be one fashioned by God from the good soil of his creation, and to be made alive with his own life. That cross of ash is a reminder that God is constant and he is a sustaining grace in our lives. In our reading this morning, we discover Jesus being baptized by John. And once again, we hear those words, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And we remember our own baptism when God spoke those words over us too, telling us who we are, calling us to live into that identity. And then following Jesus' baptism, we read of Jesus being taken by the Spirit out into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan for 40 days. So Lent, when you take away the Sundays, is that same period of time. We symbolically follow Jesus out into the wilderness. And it's that part of the story that I would like us to focus on today. Because the wilderness is such an important place in the Bible. It is that space which has not yet been domesticated by human beings. It is a space outside of towns and villages. It is both a dangerous place and a location where amazing things might happen. If you read through the Bible, you'll see just how important these wilderness moments are. Think of Jacob, the scoundrel of Genesis, Jacob, the trickster, who runs away from the consequences of his behaviour, and he falls into the grace of God. Out there in the wilderness, God interrupts Jacob's downward spiral and gives him a new life, a new purpose, and a new name. And that name is the name by which his people would then become known, Israel. And speaking of Israel, remember when they were liberated from captivity in Egypt, they wander through the wilderness, taking longer than they had anticipated. But that time was not wasted. God met them there in the wilderness and he provided for their needs. He gave them enough for each day. He guided them, sustained them, and he led them all the way to the promised land. The wilderness isn't a tame place. Don't get the wrong idea. It's not a tame place. It's uncontrolled. It is unknown. It is dangerous. And yet somehow when you're taken there by God, it is transformed into a place where new futures can be born, where deep insights can be found, and where hope is reignited. So when the Spirit takes Jesus out to the wilderness, Jesus is in good company. His ancestors had been there before him, facing their own temptations and trials. They had sadly failed most of the time. Israel's journey, for example, to the promised land took many detours because of their shortcomings and their stubbornness. But where they failed, Jesus triumphs. Mark's account of this is very sparse, and his description of what happened out there is very minimal. If you go to Matthew or to Luke's Gospel, you'll find the ways in which Satan tempted Jesus. But I like Mark's way of presenting this account. In my mind, it opens up space. Because this wilderness experience for Jesus was a testing of who he was and what he was going to do. And so too for us who follow Jesus. As we journey through Lent, we're invited to walk in his shadow, to go with him to the wilderness. And as we're out there with him, we may well experience our own form of tempting and testing. We're not Jesus, of course, and the specific details will be different. But it's a helpful metaphor of this time which leads us all the way up to Easter. We step away from the ordinary things of life, the structures that we put in place to protect ourselves, and we enter into the unknown. But we don't go there on our own. It is the Spirit who guides us there. I suppose at this point it's worth mentioning and saying that in many ways we have already been in the wilderness for just over a year. This pandemic that we've been through has been a kind of wilderness experience for so many of us. Being cut off from our usual forms of support, the usual distractions taken away from us, the new pressures now applied, and the unknown journey ahead. That all really sounds like wilderness to me. And the question I find myself asking is this: have we made the most of this experience? Because that is exactly the question that Lent presses on us time and time again every year. What are we going to do out there in the wilderness with Jesus? Because it's a vital question. Many of us, our first reaction is always to look for the way out. We want our comforts, we want our familiar rhythm, we want just the easier way of taking things for granted. We don't like the challenge of the wilderness. But what if instead of resisting this dangerous place, we were to go willingly? What if, like Jesus, we follow where the Spirit is taking us? What might we find out there in the wilderness? Well, I think we might find that we are suddenly faced with ourselves. With all the distractions stripped away, we are opened to the revelation of who we truly are. Without the painkillers and the distracting screens, the busyness that always seems so very important, without our spoon-fed answers, we are suddenly confronted by something of the reality of who we are. Because in the wilderness, hard and sometimes humiliating questions might arise. What am I doing with my life? Who am I really? Do I really trust in God? Am I what other people think I am? Do I believe the things I think I believe? You can understand, with those kind of questions being pressed on us, our first instinct is to usually run back to civilization. It's uncomfortable. To face the reality of our lives head on is not easy. But like Jesus and those before him who went to the wilderness, you might well discover that after the humiliation, the tempting, the testing, comes a newness of life that wasn't possible before. And that's where I'd kind of like to land this morning, with these few thoughts about what might we gain this time from this experience of Lent and wilderness. Because it's been such a hard year for us, hasn't it? Some have found being cut off and isolated almost too much to bear. All our patterns and familiar routines have been disrupted. It has been hard. But through the challenge of this time, we might have begun to see the grace of God working underneath it all. As we've adapted to being church online, maybe we've discovered afresh that just the great joy of being able to pray together for and with one another. We've perhaps learned and appreciating contact with others, even if it is through a screen or a text or a letter. Keeping in touch with people, catching up on just everyday things. Maybe you yourself have found a new richness of prayer. Perhaps with more time, you've been able to spend more time with God. Or maybe just the reality of pandemic and lockdown has driven you to a place of prayer, where you need to again enter into that space with God and find the peace that he can bring. How might this translate to our wilderness experience during Lent this year? Well, I believe we're in times of transition. Things are changing around us, whether we like it or not. And life won't just reset back to what it was before. And that's true of how things are with the church as well, for you and for me, the church at Clarence Road. Because maybe our journey into the wilderness this year is a time of preparation for us, teaching us to hold loosely onto things which are no longer essential, inviting us to go deeper into prayer and adoration of Christ, calling us to ask big questions like, who are we? What are we here for? That is questions for us as individuals, but perhaps more importantly, for us as a church. You know the challenges we face, and I trust that you continue in prayer in that regards. But maybe this time of disorientation in the wilderness might be fruitful for us in the long run. Maybe the Spirit is inviting us to follow Jesus out into the wilderness and to discover who we are and what we're here for. And from that place of testing, wonderful things will open up before us. Things that we couldn't have seen from the comfort of our stable and safe church life. So friends, I want to encourage you to make the most of this wilderness time in Lent. By all means, don't seek to run back to the safety too soon. Let the wildness, the freedom, the testing be a prompt to take you deeper with Jesus at this time, to listen to the voice of the Spirit, to follow the heartbeat of the Father. Let it challenge things you once thought were certain, and let it give you a renewed sense of your identity and calling. And then when we finally reach Easter Sunday, may the joy and the newness of resurrection fill your life and burst forth into all kinds of possibilities beyond your imagination. And may Christ himself be with us as we travel through this Lent season. Amen.